Assalamu alaikum, bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, bismillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah, and good evening. Welcome to another episode of The Review. Now, as many of you know, for the month of November, we've dedicated The Review to Islamophobia awareness. This week, we're taking a closer look at Islamophobia in the United States in the post-9/11 era. Now, Islamophobia may well have been an issue prior to 9/11 for Muslims in the United States, but no one could argue that the events of that day and the political climate since had enormous impact on the lives of Muslims living in America. Tonight, I'm going to be joined by a range of experts in their fields to discuss Islamophobia in the United States post-9/11. I'll be introducing my panel of guests in just a moment, but before that, take a look at this clip.
Islamophobia in the US is big business. The Council on American Islamic Relations and the University of California, Berkeley have reported that groups whose primary aim was to promote prejudice against Islam had access to almost $206 million of funding between 2008 and 2013. It is believed that this network of anti-Islam foundations continues to perpetuate prejudice that has resulted in the marginalization, discrimination, and exclusion of Muslims and those perceived to be. Gallup, the American analytics company, found that Islamophobia existed before the terrorist attacks of 9/11, but that it greatly increased in frequency afterwards. The company also reported that although there were only 160 American Muslim terrorist suspects identified in the whole of the decade following 9/11, these gained far greater news coverage than the thousands of violent acts that actually occurred in the States. How can Muslim communities in the US counter the Islamophobic narrative that exists today? With a change in government in the US, can society work as a whole to change perceptions? We find out tonight on The Review.
Welcome back. Well, you can see a litany of questions there that we are going to be looking at and examining over the next couple of hours. Now, in the first half of the show, I'm going to be joined by Ustada Nuruddin Knight, by Ruwaida Abdul Aziz, by Sheikh Hasib Noor, and by Imam Dawud Walid, all of whom I will be introducing to you very shortly. And in the second half, we're going to be joined by Zahra Billu, by Afaf Nashir, and by Khalid Bayoun. So, with no further ado, to my guests. Ustada Nuruddin Knight is a research fellow at the Yaqeen Institute. Ustada Nuruddin completed an MA in psychology with a focus on child and family from Columbia University. Alongside her academic degree, she studied traditional Islamic sciences, including Islamic law, theology, spirituality, and the prophetic biography. And she is the author of the 40 Hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha. Assalamu alaikum and welcome. Thank you for joining us. Ruwaida Abdul Aziz is a national reporter at the Huffington Post, where she spearheads the coverage of Islamophobia and the intersection of politics, culture, and gender. Some of her notable investigations include exposing anti-Muslim policies that have led to the reunification of families and the reopening of hate crime cases. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Ruwaida. Thank you for joining us. Sheikh Hasib Noor, he is the founder and president of the Legacy Institute, as well as an instructor with Al-Maghrib Institute and the Qalam Institute. He is amongst the founders of Faith Community Spaces that have sessions in London, in Austin, and in San Diego. And again, thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for joining us. He hails from Afghanistan, although he grew up in the United States, and he studied at the College of Islamic Law at the University of Medina. Assalamu alaikum. And Imam Dawud Walid is a researcher, a lecturer, a writer on the Islamic faith, and a racial justice proponent who's frequently quoted as an expert in the media. Jazakallah khair to all four of you for joining us. Thank you very much. Alhamdulillah. I mean, look, I'm old enough to remember the day of 9/11 very well. I was in my early 20s. I remember going to collect my son from school. It would have been, sort of 3, 4 o'clock in the afternoon here in the United Kingdom. And the news came in that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. And then there was that moment that kind of made the blood run cold, I think, when that second plane hit. and everybody knew this was not an accident, that something was going on here. If I could begin with yourself, Ustadha Nuruddin, tell us a little bit about your recollections of, I'm assuming you're old enough, I'm assuming you're old enough to remember it, but your recollections of that day. Okay, we're just having a little bit of trouble with your sound at the moment. I'll just come back to you. Just gonna okay, we'll try Sister Ruwaida. If I could come to you with that same question.
Absolutely. I want to just make sure you hear me all right.
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure.
And like the clip mentioned, we know Islamophobia and anti-Muslim rhetoric did not begin on 9/11, not 9/12, and certainly not 9/10, but it was definitely a day that changed the perception of Muslims, not only in the U.S., but globally. Of course, I remember the impact of that day and the events and the confusion that many of us have faced, even though I was quite young, but I think all of us can speak to how our lives changed afterwards, which is why it was incredibly important for me to continue to study journalism and go into media, because I think we all understand the firsthand impact that mainstream media had on our communities. Now, studies continue to confirm that the coverage of Muslim Americans, not just that day, but every day afterwards and even prior, continues to be one-dimensional, stagnant, and overwhelmingly negative, and that it's had real-life impacts on the ground in terms of the rise of hate crimes, bullying of school children, attacks on visible Muslim women who wear the hijab, etc. And so I think it really set a precedent, not in terms of coverage and the demand for better coverage, but also on a grassroots level and on an institutional level, the policies that came afterwards were one that many of us continue to study till this day.
Yeah, well, we're going to go on and look at some of those policies, some of the legislation, the kind of cultural impact of the change in flavour and the change of attitude towards the Muslim community after 9/11. But coming back with that same initial question, if I can come back to Ustadha Nuruddin, your initial memories of the immediate aftermath, that day happening, and then the impact on the Muslim community, perhaps on you personally, and whether you noticed and you yourself felt and were aware of that difference.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay, wonderful. So for me, that was a very interesting day because so I was impacted in a couple of different ways, but first and foremost, my mother works close to the Twin Towers. So it was first frightening personally. She had to run away from those towers to make it to safety. And then even though I was all the way in Brooklyn, we could see the smoke coming from the towers. So it was also frightening just as an American to realize that we weren't safe and that could even happen in America. And then, of course, unfortunately, the third thought as a Muslim American was, how is this going to impact me? How are people going to now view me?
Yeah, I know our experience here in the UK was very similar, in as much as many of us had, you have that initial horror that something, horrendous is happening. And then, of course, with that attack and with subsequent attacks, there's always this fear. What is going to be the backlash? How is this going to affect our community? Are people safe? Are my children safe? Are the sisters wearing hijab safe? People who are very easily visually identifiable as Muslims. If I could throw that over to Sheikh Hasib, what was your experience of that day and the immediate aftermath?
First of all, Jazakum khair, alhamdulillah, I really appreciate Islam Channel putting this together because it has to do with not just as much as seeing our history, but how to move forward in the future. So I really appreciate this kind of discourse that's needed. I remember I was walking into Mrs. Jones' advanced English class, and she had this look because she was from New York, but it was in Texas. She had moved, and she sees and I see at the same exact time that second plane hitting. And at that moment, it really wasn't a shock factor, but the subsequent, I think, backlash afterward was that Muslims were under a lot of scrutiny. I was one of 4 Muslims in my entire high school of 3,200 kids. Now that's for those of you who are not, very, very well informed in Texas, that's almost like an entire university in the UK. And we just basically had to be more Muslim. And that was something that actually helped me to study Islam more. That moment and what subsequently followed helped me to actually become a better Muslim. In fact, right when I landed into America just yesterday, and I got, mashallah, my second how are you, hello screening in immigration that happens almost all the time, just because, yet again, it's a policy of scrutiny that came after 9/11, where Muslims are being targeted by statistic much more so than the average person. I had to have that same conversation of, what is it that you do? And I have to have that conversation telling them I'm an Imam, I'm a person who represents the religious scholarship in the community, for undoing a lot of what's going on happens in this, the post-Islamophobia.
And that's, I think, something that's fallen on everybody. I think every Muslim feels that as an individual. We all have this kind of responsibility to project. We're constantly sort of trying to avoid being apologetic, but to project this image of positive Islam. If I could come to you, Imam Dawud, the same question. Your recollections of that day and the initial aftermath.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi man wala. Well, for me, my son, my firstborn, was actually birthed 7 days before 9/11 took place. And I remember, after looking at the coverage and my mother being at the house, one of the first things that came into my mind is I began to grieve, not only the lives that were lost, but I grieved that my son would not know how it is to grow up and live as a Muslim in America the way it was when I was younger, because there was a drastic shift, as probably I'll explain later, as far as the public perception of Muslims in America. So I grieve that. I remember, too, that it was also something that was very pivotal for me in two ways. The first is I had just been hired as assistant imam at a masjid here in Detroit area. And we organized brothers and were taking turns literally having post and 24-hour security on the masjid, including myself. I stayed a number of nights overnight where we had two people on post to make sure that the masjid wasn't vandalized or burned down. So we immediately rushed into that mode within a day or two after 9/11. The second is I used to write a weekly article for a local paper called the Muslim Observer. And at the time, when everyone had landlines, my phone was actually unlisted, and I received a phone call to my home, and they said, as someone called and said, "Is this the residence of Dawud Walid?" And I'm like, "Yes." And then they said, "We're coming to get you." Wow. The next day, all four tires on my car were flattened, and my windshield was busted.
Wow.
Right. So it was something that came directly to my home. And also, just to underscore it, that I live in the blackest city in America, right? So it's 80% African American right now. At the time, at 9/11, it was 90% black. So I didn't think that, I couldn't imagine, I never imagined in my wildest dreams that in the city of Detroit, which was 90% black at the time, about 20 years ago, that something like that would happen to me as a Muslim, but it happened.
I mean, that's quite shocking, really, that, an unlisted telephone number, and in the immediate hours, really, after, you were experiencing that sort of rampant reaction, that knee-jerk reaction with Islamophobic responses like that. Look, America has some history when it comes to its treatment of minorities. Of course, we all know the Black Lives Matters movement and the fantastic progress that's been made this year in terms of raising some of that awareness. But when I talk about history, I know that 100 years ago, Catholics were public enemy number one. Of course, after the Wall Street crash, it was the Jewish community that was being blamed. I came across some staggering statistics. 61% of Americans did not want to offer asylum to Jewish children who were fleeing Nazi persecution. And 100,000 Japanese were interned after the Second World War. So America has a history of turning inwards on itself and rejecting the other when they feel that they're under attack. In this case, it was certainly the Muslim population. I mean, Ustadh Nuruddin, if I can come to you, the immediate reaction, not from our community, but from politicians, how important was that in affecting the environment? Because we know that there was, as we've heard from Imam Dawud, there was this immediate backlash. But George Bush, I think it was about 6 days after 9/11, he went to the Islamic Center in DC. And I believe that did have an impact. It had some it was able to mitigate somewhat the kind of immediate fury after the attacks.
Right. I think that unlike our most recent president, George W. Bush was actually, in terms of what he did.
Okay, I'm really sorry, Ustadha Nuruddin, we're just struggling with your audio again. I'm going to come back to you on that. Ruwaida, if I can come to you, Sister Ruwaida, you know, how crucial at that time, and I'm not talking about now because since then we've had Obama, we've had Trump, we've got Biden, and I want to look at those. But at that time, how crucial was the tone of the political rhetoric? Specifically, not when we talk about the war on terror, I'm talking about for Islamophobia within the United States and the experience of Muslims on the street.
It was incredibly important for George Bush to come out then and to give out those words and send a message essentially by going to a masjid. And, you know, these are some of the actions that we continue to look and we criticize folks today in terms of presidential candidates and presidents. You know, we know President Obama didn't visit a masjid until quite late. And so when we look at the impact that it had in 2001, although the statistics continue to be horrifying and we know that the impact was brutal, it was definitely important. I mean, we see today Islamophobia is essentially used as a political strategy on the campaign trail, whether you're running for president to send a message, whether you're running for local and state elections as well. We've seen various candidates see or perceive that spewing anti-Muslim sentiment was a successful tactic, and it was going to garner them votes, and it was going to place them in office. And so we've seen an increase in that specific political strategy, specifically after 2016 when Donald Trump won his election and he became president. And we saw other politicians who thought, well, if this worked for him at the time, perhaps it'll work for us. And so no doubt we know that the way the Muslim community is used, whether it's by Republicans or Democrats, both sides of political parties, the way that they're spoken about, spoken against, or spoken to in many instances plays a role in their political runs.
Yeah, I'm going to try and come back to Ustadha Nuruddin on that. We'll just check your sound again. Ustadha Nuruddin, that same question. You know, we've heard from Sister Ruwaida the immediate impact of that political rhetoric. If I can come to you with the same question.
Yeah, I think the impact of it was really powerful for us as Muslims. Of course, there were still hate crimes, but at least to have the leadership say that it's not the fault of Muslim Americans. Yeah. And I think that, alhamdulillah, it was an effort to not repeat some of those same mistakes like what happened with the Japanese. So it was a good effort on his part to have that rhetoric.
It is important. Sheikh Hasib, we're hearing how important that rhetoric is, but despite the rhetoric, the immediate legislation that came out very quickly, sort of the one that springs to mind, of course, is the Patriot Act, and this initial declaration on a war on terror, you know, whatever that meant. Did the implications of that, did that ripple through the Muslim community immediately, or did it take time for the Muslims to begin to see how this was going to affect them in their day-to-day goings-on in the United States?
I mean, I think the after effects of everything that you see from the Patriot Act or the policies which, you know, directly, affected Muslims is not something that was only directly from post 9/11, but after the policies that were enacted afterwards, you saw a lack of, I think, direct communication with the Muslim community, as Ruwaida was mentioning. And I think that's part and parcel of what led to the Iraq war, you know, all of this kind of propaganda and apparatus that basically gave false information about an entire community that was in another country, and also things that were occurring at that time. Similarly, the Patriot Act, what had happened to the Japanese, what has been happening in the Black community since inception. This notion of grandiose policies that don't really reflect the realities and almost scapegoat a minority, at the same time putting under surveillance in order to justify the state apparatus. I mean, this is something that, one thing I'm just going to be very frank and upfront with you all, is that post 9/11 Islam in America made the Muslims work harder to really enact the responsibility of what it means to be Muslim in a country, in a nation state such as America. And I think that's one thing a lot of us as you realize, for example, we have now journalists like Ruwaida. We have women scholars like we have Nuruddin. We have Imam and a director for civil rights, an author published on religious activism like Sheikh Dawud Walid.
Yeah.
So this is a product of the post 9/11 world that we had to step it up and deal with these kind of policies.
I think we saw a lot of that here in the United Kingdom as well. We certainly saw an opening up of interfaith relations. We saw a willingness for Muslim and a necessity for Muslim organizations to stand up and be counted, to counter the narrative and to make sure that that was heard in the right places. Imam Dawud, what was your experience of seeing the Muslim community coming together to form that counter narrative in those early years after 9/11?
Well, what I remember is that there was a number of segments of our community that were more insular that saw the need to become more open. So masajid began to have open houses, advertising in newspapers and inviting people to the masajid. Many masajid began to be involved in interfaith work. So there was an opening up of several segments within the Muslim community. Back in those days, we were still debating a large percentage of our community about whether it was halal or haram to even vote in elections. I remember those days, right, where a significant percentage of the community was saying it's haram to vote. Like that discussion is pretty much gone and left us at this particular point in time. But I would say that as that opening up came, there was some unintended consequences that came with that. And what took place is that there was a generation that grew up that saw a lot of interfaith and outreach to the community, to the broader community, but I believe that some of it was unprincipled, to the point that many Muslims these days view Muslim more as a type of quasi-ethnic socio-political identity, and it's not really based in our creed, in our spirituality. So then we have issues of theological and moral relativism. We have Muslims who, a community that went to being very conservative to now, in some cases, being more so-called progressive than the broader American society on a number of issues that are completely forbidden in our deen. So there was some opening up, but I think that it was not without consequence.
Right. Some, as you said, some unintended consequences. Well, look, please stay with us. We're going to be going to a short break. When we come back, I'd like to maybe look at a quick look at maybe the Obama years, because that, I think, for many people from minority ethnic backgrounds was seen as, hopefully heralding a new era. But what did it mean for the Muslims in the United States? So we'll be back with you in just a few minutes. Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to the review, where tonight we are looking at Islamophobia in the United States in the post 9/11 era. If I go back to my guests, welcome all. Thank you for staying with us. If I could come back to you, Ustadha Nuruddin. Immediately after 9/11, the rhetoric started, the war on terror and a very inexorable build-up to the war in Iraq. What was that like for the Muslim community to see, your nation building up one of the biggest invasion forces that the world has ever seen, really, on the other side of the world, with all of the kind of, tenuous evidence and the kind of weapons of mass destruction and stuff that was going on? How was that being perceived by the community? Ustadha Nuruddin.
Yes, well, it was, again, frightening in two ways, because we are Americans. I am an American born and raised. So there is the fear that we're being attacked, so we have to fight back. But then there's that other fear of, well, what is this building into? And, it was first Afghanistan and then Iraq, and then it's becoming a war, terror seeming to become a code for Muslim. And so it was very frightening for what that means for us as a ummah, and then again, also what that means for us as Muslims in America. But it's complicated because we also want to be protected in America, and we don't want to be attacked. So I think our response was exaggerated, of course. And so it was pretty scary times, and just trying to understand what's going on and what that means for us as Muslims.
Sister Ruwaida, do you think that there is a specific dynamic which applies to women when it comes to Islamophobia in the United States? And in those early days, again, we're looking at the kind of post 9/11 era, the gearing up, the jingoistic stuff, saying, we're going to war, we're fighting this war against this enemy who is terror, so to speak, this enormous invasion force. Do you feel that our sisters were more acutely affected by that than potentially the brothers? Was there the potential for that?
Absolutely, without a doubt. And statistics continue to prove that. Look, at the end of the day, it was about visible markers. And there were community members who weren't even Muslim, right? Folks who just perceived to be brownish, right? Who are part of other faith groups who were attacked. We know that the first quote-unquote Islamophobic hate crime didn't happen to a Muslim, right? And so I think when we talk about Muslim women in particular, Muslim women who wear the hijab, they tend to be on the front line of physical assaults, verbal harassments, etc. We've seen a scary rise of cases of Muslim women having their hijab pulled off. We saw an increase of just policing of Muslim women's bodies generally when they were just partaking in casual day-to-day life, like dropping off their children to school, like going to the beach, like trying to go to work, etc. And I think this intersection of sexism and misogyny and also the fetishization of Muslim women's bodies, right? We saw this also increase with the wars happening abroad, the white savior complex wanting to save, black and brown women from these so-called oppressive religion. All of this rhetoric really started to impact how Muslim women were perceived, but also how they were treated in terms of not only within their own communities, but trying to go about their day-to-day lives. And so I think that entire facet of gendered Islamophobia is a large one, because there are so many elements there in which we see how Muslim women are directly and acutely impacted compared to, say, Muslim men. But I think one thing that has been fascinating, a little bit of a silver lining, a recent study by the ISPU had said that despite all the challenges and the obstacles that Muslim women continue to face, that they were still thriving. That Muslim women say were not taking off their hijabs because they were afraid, right, of backlash, that they were still, more than their Muslim male counterparts, were getting higher education degrees, that they were more likely to support movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I think it's incredible to see that a segment of the community, despite taking the majority of those gut punches, were still succeeding in being active in their spaces and being active in the community and beyond the community.
Yeah, and it's interesting to look at it as of course, the Muslim community is an extremely diverse community. It is here and it is in the United States. If I can come to you, Sheikh Hasib, you yourself are from an Afghan background, and prior to the war on Iraq, of course, there was the war in Afghanistan. How, as an Afghani community, that's got to be very tricky. It's going to be very tricky to deal with. You're living, you're many of the community are born, you're bred in the United States, you're Americans, you're very proud of being Americans, and at the same time, your nation is going to war against the place that was formerly home.
I mean, yeah, this is one of the realities that many of the diaspora, I think, have to deal with, especially with Afghans. I mean, we've literally grown, and some of us lived and died in war. There's not a family member except that they have shuhada, meaning martyrs among our families. And especially, I mean, I'm talking about somebody who's raised in America, went to school here, went to high school, played basketball team and all that. And I remember the first memories that I would have as a young child is in 1998, Clinton launching drone strikes into America that last, now we're talking, Trump had more drone strikes than even Obama. And Obama was known for even his recent biography that he wrote, autobiography, speaking about almost excusing these drone strikes for the greater national security threat and the forgotten war and the forgotten casualties of Afghanistan. This is a reality I think we grew up with. But one of the things that I think that grows out of that is the diaspora question of who am I and why do I stand for the values that I do? And that has caused a lot of the Afghan, who grew up in America, to really go back either to their identity or flee from their identity. So Muslim identity became center core based on a lot of the, you could say, Islamophobia that existed. And that, I'm telling you from a personal perspective, it led people either to discover their faith more because you go back to your central purpose, or it would go the opposite direction, and the natural aspect of acquiescence of wanting to be accepted that has existed to this day. Muslims just wanting to be accepted by society. So I will say and do whatever I need to do and drink what I need to drink and go to any kind of networking gathering that I need to do just in order to be accepted in society. That was a big part and parcel of the Islamophobia, or what I like to call the anti-Islam that has happened after 9/11 and lasted until today.
Yeah, and that's something that Imam Dawud, something you touched on just before the break, those sort of unintended consequences of the willingness or the need for the Muslim community to engage with the wider mainstream. I'd like to ask you, Imam Dawud, look, with the Bush was Bush, and that started the war on terror, and America was all heading in one way. With the Obama era, was there a hope from the Muslim community that things were going to be different, that the rhetoric was going to change, that this was potentially a new era in interfaith, inter-race relations, and that the Muslim community had something potentially to look forward to?
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was having deja vu with Bernie Sanders when he was running for the Democratic nomination, because I remember those exact same sentiments being expressed about Obama, where many Muslims were treating Obama as if he was going to be the Mahdi, right? Like he came from a Muslim background. His father was from Kenya, and he had a Muslim name, and then he lived in Indonesia. And a lot of Muslims had high hopes. This black man with the middle name Hussein, who made the comment that the most beautiful sound that he heard was the adhan, would do something for Muslims. And then he got voted in, and then the first foreign visit that he made actually was to Egypt, where he gave that speech at Jam al-Azhar.
That's right.
So Muslims had high hopes in President Barack Hussein Obama. Unfortunately, many of his policies were a continuation of that which came before. When it came to the drone bombings, especially in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, they actually increased. There was a higher percentage of civilians who were Muslims who were killed. There was the tragic killing of Abdurrahman Awlaqi in Yemen, a teenager, him and his father killed without any charges against his father. The ramping up of AFRICOM, which is a strategic American military type of a logistical order in which President Obama increased the military presence in Africa, including drone base in Niger, or some pronounce Niger. So from a foreign policy perspective, Obama wasn't really much better than Bush at all as far as what he did abroad, and then even here locally. And I myself, we have data on this at CARE, but the actual infiltration of our masajid, right, and the trying to entice people to become informants on the community, the forming of CVE, the counter-violent extremism program, this started under a so-called progressive black president with the middle name Hussein. And it was an escalation of Islamophobic policies. But, alhamdulillah, he invited the Muslims to the White House for the iftar in Ramadan and gave us some hummus, while he was giving more weapons to Israel when they were bombing Gaza during Ramadan. So, the Muslims were probably a little more, happy with Obama. But I was extremely disappointed with President Obama, and to the point that in the civil rights community, I know that some of us in the second term actually said, this may shock some of your viewers, but some of us said, we actually long for the days of Bush. Wow. In comparison to the second term of Obama.
I mean,
and I'm not exaggerating.
That really is surprising to hear. I think, we from this side of the pond don't understand those sort of subtle dynamics, the race dynamics, the enormous symbolism of a black man being president of the United States, of course, as well as you guys would. But it is surprising to hear that people would be feeling that about his second term. Ustada Nuruddin, do you feel that Obama lost touch with the Muslim community? Because I know that people of color and the Muslims really did, as we just heard from Imam Dawud, saw him as somebody who was going to bring an era of dialogue, that sense of being the other as a Muslim, that was going to end now under Hussein Obama. Do you feel that he lost a significant proportion of the Muslim community?
I think the Obama presidency is a difficult one to assess because of his being the first black president, because there is a difference between a president who presents at least a rhetoric he is on your side. It's very difficult for people to then sort of detect the nuance, not exactly on your side. So it was a complicated time. Obama had the Ramadan and Muslims were in the White House. We felt represented and heard by him. And at the same time, he was doing things outside of our best interest. So they were complicated times. As someone who is black, it was also a hopeful moment to see him as the first black president. So it's difficult. There's the image of Obama, and then there's the reality of him that is unfortunately disappointing in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Sister Ruwaida, I mean, you were talking a little while ago just about the impact, particularly on Muslim women. This is something that's continued, hasn't it? I mean, we're talking, so far about the immediate aftermath of 9/11. We've spoken about, the Iraq War. We've spoken about Obama. But I understand that, pretty recently, a squash team, an entire squash team, were asked to remove their hijabs. We have this sports figure, Noor Alexandria Abu Karam, who again and again is facing prejudice as a Muslim sister, a hijab-wearing woman who wants to break away from these stereotypes. But again and again and again, despite all the years that have passed, Muslim women in particular are facing this kind of stereotypical prejudice.
Yes, going back to what I was saying earlier, Muslim women continue to face a unique set of challenges because of the fact that they are visible Muslim women. Representation at the end of the day, we have to question this concept of representation and what does it actually do in terms of the way we treat and the rules put in place. And so in these instances, there are rules, especially we see in sports, that the hijab is a danger to these athletes, and which is why we saw in Noor's case, she was asked to take it off. We've had different trailblazers who've tried to make it into various sports leagues and get these rules overturned in sports like basketball and boxing, etc. And so the hijab still to many Americans who non-Muslim Americans still don't quite understand exactly what the hijab is. We see it just slowly being touched upon in different cultural aspects in our lives, but I think it is not fully understood, and the rules that continue to police a Muslim women's dress are quite antiquated. We're seeing some changes, though. We know FIBA quite recently because of Bilqis, a Muslim basketball player, and her efforts getting that overturned. In Noor's case, her state is currently voting on the measure to no longer require special permission or a waiver to wear the hijab while playing in her local student association. And so we're starting to make strides. And I think what's particularly impactful is that Muslim Americans only make 1% of the U.S. population. We're still a tiny fraction of this country. We're absolutely not a monolith, right? There's still quite this focus on Arab and South Asian Muslims, right? The oldest Muslim community is the Black Muslim community. We still vote very differently. We react to political trends very differently. And all of this is a positive aspect that I think we as a community are still grappling with. And the people who are outside of the Muslim community are still understanding as well. And that continues to hold true for Muslim women who wear the hijab in the different various facets in their lives.
Yeah, it's a remarkably complex subject. And I know we can only scratch the surface today say, really. But we haven't even mentioned Trump yet, and Trump and the Muslim ban and all that rhetoric, and the seemingly impossible thing for us over here to understand that his Muslim vote went up in the recent election. We can't go into that at the moment. I'm hoping we can look at some of that in our next segment with our new guest. But I want to come back to Imam Dawud, if I may, just on something that we briefly touched upon. You spoke about those unintended consequences of the engagement certainly that Sheikh Hasib, you spoke about as well, that engagement, reaching out for many times, in many cases for the first time, the need to reach out of our insular Muslim communities into the wider community. And you said that we're familiar with this term Islamophobia, but you mentioned this term Imanophobia. Certainly the first time I've heard about that. Tell me a little bit more about what you mean by Imanophobia.
Well, the term Imanophobia is not really a popular term in the American Muslim lexicon, but basically what this Imanophobia is that Islamophobia in many ways in the United States of America has nothing to do with actually our beliefs. In many ways, it's treating American Muslims more as like a quasi-ethnic group that falls outside of the construct of whiteness in the United States of America, right? Which there's a lot of racial and xenophobic implications with that, right? So the right after 9/11 became openly Islamophobic, right? Not just many politicians, such as Representative Peter King, that held a type of Joe McCarthy era type witch hunt in Congress on American Muslims and organizations, CARE being the primary target of that situation. But also activists, and it was mentioned about the Islamophobia network. On the left, rhetorically speaking, even though in public policy, many people on the left were supporting some of the exact same problematic issues, such as the Patriot Act, such as the undoing of the FISA court, such as the invasion of Iraq. But people on the left were at least more, in the name of pluralism, apparently seemed to be more open towards Muslims. And Muslims then made a hard shift over to the left. The consequences of this is that many people on the left who would embrace Muslims within the identity politics of a marginalized group outside of white, straight patriarchy began to have and continue to make certain demands on the Muslim community, not just from politicians, but from foundations that fund certain activists that have grown in the community, to also other activists that say, okay, we've come and we've scratched your back on this Islamophobia thing, right, and we want you to support us on X, Y, Z issue that relates to sexuality, that relates to gender. And in fact, many people on the left who say that they like Muslims as this minority group are actually hostile towards our sacred law, are actually hostile towards Islamic morality, and are beginning to make demands on Muslims in the name of quid pro quo, and want us to capitulate even from institutional and organizational levels. And this is what I mean by Imanophobia. Yeah,
I mean, those sorts of moral mazes, I think, are inevitable. When we are all, in many respects, all Muslims in the West, we're living in unprecedented times. We are born in the West, and we are not going anywhere, inshallah. And we're having to grapple with these kind of conflicting identities and with the geopolitics of the situation. It is difficult. Look, we're coming to the end of this segment. Sheikh Hasib, if I could give you the last word on this, just coming back there, reflecting on what Imam Dawud said, this idea of the Muslim community sort of fracturing, some of them going one way, becoming more pious, more religious, others bending over backwards and maybe too far in order to appease the left, who are their natural allies. Is this something that you fear looking ahead, that the community becoming more fractured in trying to deal with the issues of Islamophobia and their place within America?
I would, for sure. I mean, that was one of my first initial reactions when Biden became president. I was actually afraid that we were in survival mode. I mean, Trump made Muslims almost feel like they're not welcome literally by Muslim ban, the term being used. Now that Biden is there, it's almost like there's some Muslims almost like breathing a sigh and saying, oh, we're going back to Obama. How was that ever a good thing in the first place, in that general, for us to not take as citizens our leaders and hold them accountable? And what I think, that I just want to correct you on one thing. I don't believe this term of creating a dichotomy within the Muslim mind of being pious and righteous versus liberal and progressive, and liberal and conservative being a thing that exists in Islam. We're Muslims, and we're 43%. 4 out of 10 Muslim Americans go to the masjid and attend the masjid a week. 18% of that increased to more than that. So we are some of the most attended worship space going American citizens that exists. And that actually is a force of faith that does not exist in America. Faith in general is going low. One thing I just want to leave off with by saying that we now, moving forward, I have to understand how the function of the traditional nation state under secularism is going to affect the Muslim community as a faith group that has morality, that we are not a cultural identity group. We are a faith group that has a lived experience as a faith. We don't acclaim to having Muslim as a cultural identity. So it requires us Muslims to educate ourselves more about our faith and how to articulate our time in a post 9/11, and you guys in the UK, especially with the rise of the far right and the rhetoric of France and the rhetoric of now the EU president himself saying that imams should go a certified European Union training that would certify a Islam palatable to Europe. This is complete nonsense. I mean, the fact that the word Islamophobia has actually been abused. We, in fact, in my terms, should use the word anti-Islam. It's no longer intended ignorance. It's actually an intended way of surveying the type of Islam that citizens follow. And the only way to pervade this entire process is for Muslims to become better Muslims, to become people who actually understand their faith and how to articulate that narrative in a time where you're going to have difficult discussions of how do we work in a system where we have to articulate what is Islam's stance on sexuality, what is Islam's stance on gender, and what is Islam's stance on a number of issues. Right. And I'm afraid that if we don't have discourses, we're going to fracture even more and create dichotomies that the Jewish community and the Christian community fell into. And in fact, in reality, the Muslim community is not like those communities in that sense. We believe in a different sense of existence in terms of faith, and the plurality that exists should be a discussion to have to address, not for us to fracture even more.
Okay, I just need to come in there. Ustadha Nuruddin, many things that we've talked about. A final word from yourself. You know, for the Muslim community in America, what is the direction? What is the way forwards?
Right, I think that a lot of great points have been made, and while we focused a lot in the conversation on Islamophobia, I think it's absolutely true that we have to talk about and think about Imanophobia as well, and that is just to be vigilant on both sides. So whether that's a direct attack on us as Muslims, for people who are looking at us as an ethnic, racial group, or a direct attack on our faith, we have to be wary of both. And utilize the means to fight against both from our faith and as American citizens who have rights in this country.
Thank you very much. And Sister Ruwaida, finally, are you hopeful? Are we going in the right direction? Are the years ahead going to be rosier than the years past?
I don't know if it'll be rosier, but I'm certainly hopeful. And I think as a person of faith, it's important to remain hopeful in order to accomplish what we want to accomplish in this country and elsewhere. So yes, I remain hopeful.
I'm glad to hear it. Thank you. Well, look, it's time for another break, after which we're going to be joined by my new guests. In the meantime, I would like to extend a massive thank you to Ustadha Nuruddin, to Sister Ruwaida Abdul Aziz, to Sheikh Hasib Noor, and of course to Imam Dawud Walid for joining us. Thank you all for your fantastic contributions. We wish you all the best. We pray for your success in the coming era, inshallah. As for you guys, don't go anywhere. We're coming back with some more guests. We're continuing to talk on Islamophobia in the United States post 9/11. See you in just a few minutes. Assalamu alaikum and welcome back to the review, where tonight we're looking at Islamophobia in the United States in the post 9/11 era. Now, moving on, I would like to introduce my new guests for the second half of tonight's show. Let me begin by introducing Sister Zahra Billu. Now, she is an attorney who serves as the Executive Director on the Council of American Islamic Relations, the San Francisco Bay Area office, that's known as CARE, one of the oldest and the largest CARE chapter offices. CARE is dedicated to the empowerment of American Muslims through legal services, legislative advocacy, and community organizing. Now, under Sister Zahra's leadership, CARE has seen lawsuits against the United States Department of Justice, Abercrombie and Finch, the Southwest Airlines, representing American Muslims facing discrimination and discriminatory treatment, offering direct legal representation to Bay Area residents facing numerous civil rights violations, including FBI interviews, employment discrimination, airport harassment, school bullying, and hate crimes. SubhanAllah, what a fantastic amount of work. And of course, your advocacy has included media appearances in local and national media, including MSNBC, NPR, the San Francisco Chronicle, and even Fox News. Welcome. Assalamu alaikum, Sister Zahra.
Walaikum assalam.
Thank you very much for joining us. We're also joined by Afaf Nasher. She is, and I believe that's pronounced Nasher. Is that correct, Afaf?
Correct, yes, very good.
Nasher, thank you. Who again is an attorney at law and currently serves as the Executive Director for the New York chapter of CARE, as we mentioned, the fantastic work that CARE are doing. Now, before shifting her focus to civil rights advocacy, she worked as an associate at the law firm of Ross and Crowley, LLP, performing work in commercial litigation. Her involvement with CARE New York stems from an enthusiasm to challenge discrimination in all its forms and promote positive activism. Assalamu alaikum and welcome.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And we welcome back to the review Dr. Khalid Beydoun, who is an Associate Professor of Law at the University of Detroit Mercy School of Law and Senior Affiliated Faculty with the University of California, Berkeley in their Islamophobia Research Project. Assalamu alaikum, welcome back, Dr. Khalid.
Assalamu alaikum, thanks for having me.
Last time you were, of course, sitting here with me in the studio. I'm glad to see you got home safely.
Appreciate that, yeah, but I still wish I was there with you.
How kind of you. Okay, look, moving on, guys. I don't know how much of the first half you were able to join in, but it was really stimulating. We were able to talk about, the first question was recollections of 9/11. I mean, look, this is all about the kind of post 9/11 era, and our guest spoke about their immediate recollections, then the sort of political aftermath, the implications of the Iraq War, and the what that had on the community. We came up with a term, or we had a term I've not heard before, Imanophobia, and the risk of the Muslim community now fracturing. I'd like to move on and look at the sort of political representation of Muslims within the United States, because that's come a long way since 9/11. And before I go to the election of Keith Ellisman, the congressman, and how important that was, I would like to ask each of you yourselves that first initial question. Your initial recollections of that moment back in September 2001 and your initial feelings about when that happened. If I could start with you, Zahra.
Sure. Gosh, it was so long ago. I was 17. I was a freshman in college, and what I remember specifically from the day of the attacks is my dad calling the landline at our house and, urging my mom and I to stay indoors. He was very worried that as visible Muslim women that we would be among the first to be attacked. Yeah. And he was right in terms of what we saw with the fallout of hate crimes, targeting not just visible Muslim women, but Sikh Americans, Arab Christians, and so many others who were mistaken for Muslims at the time.
Actually, we had exactly the same thing here. The first person who actually died as a result of an Islamophobic attack was a Sikh taxi driver, who was in the kind of heated political rhetoric after 9/11 was targeted unjustly, unfairly, and inaccurately as a Muslim, and was actually murdered. If I could come to you, Dr. Khalid, what are your initial recollections of the moments, days, and weeks after those attacks back in September 2001?
Yeah, I was a first-year law student at UCLA. Had just moved to Los Angeles from Detroit. Was grappling with living in a new city without a community at the time, and really, thinking about my family back home in Detroit. Detroit is home to a really large and concentrated Muslim community. Many of my friends, my masjid was vandalized. I thought about my mom and my sister. So I was young, and it really transformed my professional trajectory. I thought I'd be a civil rights attorney, but it took me down a path of, becoming a scholar grappling with Islamophobia.
That's right. I think for many people, I think that they had a change of direction, and certainly the community took a change of direction, and that's what I'm going to come on to next. I just want to come back to Afaf Nashad before that and just say, again, your initial recollections, the effect that it had on your sense of being a Muslim in America, and of course a hijab-wearing Muslim. I don't mean to assume that 20 years ago you were old enough to remember all of this or to even be wearing hijab, but no doubt you would have been aware of the immediate changes in the community.
Yeah. So old enough to take everything, and as a matter of fact, I have two young children, both under the age of 3 years, and two in the neighborhood. Remember, I'm from New York, so this was really an hour backyard. And we first got the call to out.
Sister Afaf, sorry, Sister Afaf, I'm just going to have to come in there. The internet connection on your connection isn't great at the moment. We're just going to see what we can do with that. And I will come back to you on that question in a moment. So just give us a second. We're going to see what we can do with that. In the meantime, if I could come back to Sister Zahra. Look, each and every one of us, look, we were thousands of miles away, and the Muslim community here certainly felt that very instantaneous focus of the world, of our communities. We felt that we were introspection in a way that hadn't happened before, and some good consequences came out of that. The Muslim community reached out in a way that they hadn't done before, and we've seen Muslim representation in politics escalate in a way that we hadn't seen before. How significant was it when Keith Ellison was the first sort of openly Muslim congressman? What sort of message did that send out to the community? And do you think that was a milestone, first of all? And do you think it was motivation for other young Muslims to say, this is possible? We need to get more involved at a political level. And sorry, just before I ask you to answer that, Imam Dawud, who we had in the first half, said he remembers before 9/11, when it was a kind of very open discussion, should Muslims even vote amongst Muslim communities? Should we even be involved in this process at all? That certainly changed after 9/11.
Absolutely. Pre-9/11, there was a lot of conversation about should we vote? Is it permissible? Dr. Khalid, I don't know if you had this question come up in your family, but for me, as someone who wanted to be a lawyer, I've heard from others in my family who said at one point we debated whether or not you could be a lawyer in the U.S. legal system without violating your practice of Islam. And so there was that happening, but also there were people engaged in activism, engaged in political work. CARE, for example, had been around since the early 90s. What 9/11 did was stunt some of that growth for a period of time. And so it's not to say that it went from that we were not at all doing any of this work pre-9/11, but post 9/11, it became about survival and not about success and leadership, at least in the early years.
Yeah.
As the years pass, you see Keith Ellison rise to publicity and then to public office. And for sure, it was a very exciting thing for a lot of people in the community to say, we can now look to Congress and see someone who looks like us, who prays like us, and who is proud of their beliefs. But even that is an ongoing process to say, okay, so he is a Muslim in Congress. That does not make him the model Muslim. It doesn't mean that we are going to agree with everything he does. And to remind ourselves that though we support him, we are not all his constituents. He doesn't owe me anything in California. He has a specific group of people who elect him. But he opened the door. He really coming in at the highest rank, right? So running not for city council or the school board, but being a member of Congress has then been followed now, mashallah, by a number of other Muslims who have obtained seats in Congress, some who ran and didn't win. But even that opens doors, helps young kids see themselves in these positions. I will always remember an inner city first generation immigrant community I was visiting a couple of years ago, and there were, young Muslim girls whose parents don't even speak English, who have working class jobs, saying, my name is so-and-so, and I'm going to run for president of the United States. And that now feels more real and possible for them because of how many Muslims have ran for office successfully and even less successfully in the last 20 years.
Yeah. And I think it's fair to say that a lot of those changes were catalyzed by what happened, 9/11, the Muslim community needing to have a voice, needing to be represented, and needing to have a place at the table. If I can try and come back to you, Afaf Nasher, just on that initial question, your initial recollections and the impact on the community.
Well, let's test that connection. Are we okay now?
We're better.
Okay. All right. Doesn't sound like perfect, but let's try to get through this. So yes, what I was saying, my brother, is that I'm actually in New York. So the towers were in my backyard. Yeah. We saw the devastation. We saw our NYPD and first responders and fire department go in. We saw the ashes on people's faces and the tears in a very real way. And we had family members and neighbors and friends and colleagues who were there on the scene, both within the area of devastation, as well as those that were going into the area to help. And so, just receiving that initial call to open up the news, something's going on, was of course devastating. I don't think many of us will forget seeing that and thinking, is this some sort of fake movie? And then understanding that this is the horror of reality. Yeah. And sitting there speechless, just absolutely stunned at what you were viewing, and understanding the impact that this has immediately upon those who are within harm's way, and thinking, like, inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, in a very real sense, like, oh my God, people are dying, people are panicking, people are calling their relatives to see who's there and if they've made it out with it from that area. And so there's a lot of chaos on that end. And just watching that dust settle, both literally and figuratively, to see what was going to come out of that. Now, I had just moved into a new neighborhood. I already knew I was going to go to law school at the time. I had taken a hiatus between college and law school because I had 2 small children. And I remember having similar conversations as with Sister Zahra with my father, and my 2 young girls were extremely young. I mean, they were like 3 and 1, and they were copying mom with the hijab. And I remember having a discussion with my dad and him saying, you can't put that on them going out. You're in a neighborhood that doesn't have many people of color to begin with. They will think that you're putting on that hijab on those young girls because you are too radical, you're too fundamental, you're too conservative. And I just responded to him in the most honest way that I could, and that is, I could never look at them in the face and then look and tell them to take it off, and then be able to look at myself in the mirror without a sense of hypocrisy. Right. That's not the message I could give to my children. And so we knew there were going to be hard times coming, but that we needed to face them.
Well, look, speaking about those hard times coming, and just reflecting from my own recollections, I remember my mother who was non-Muslim. I remember her phoning me, terrified about myself and her grandchildren, my children, because my son at that time was at a Muslim school where all the little boys wore a little thobe and a little kufi hat, and she was saying, don't go out, this is you're going to be under attack. And I remember the mosque having to get security, all sorts of things. So I don't think anybody who was alive at that time, certainly with a consciousness of what was going on, can forget. It certainly was a part of history which changed so many aspects of Muslim life within the West and outside. I want to come on to a legal question, all three of you being from a legal background. When we look at the implications, when we look at how things change, of course, we had the Department of Homeland Security, which I think was something that was new after 9/11, 2003, and then we also had the Patriot Act. Now, the Patriot Act, if I could start with you, Sister Zahra, how significant was that for the Muslim community? And do you think anybody understood at the time what the implications were going to be?
The Patriot Act changed the way a lot of immigrant Muslims saw their relationship with the government. I think it really brought to light what many other communities, by the way, were already experiencing in terms of surveillance, harassment, and targeting. And people knew immediately, to the credit of American Muslims and our fellow Americans, there was immediate outrage. However, one of the challenges that we face every time we are striking a balance between security and liberty is that America consistently falls into the trap of security theater. We will very happily give away all of our liberties as a mass here. Our politicians do it all the time for the sake of the semblance of security. But there was outrage immediately. Local cities passed resolutions condemning it. I remember one of the things I remember being really intrigued by as a young activist was seeing librarians organize against it, because the Patriot Act permitted federal officials to come in and look at what you were reading. And nobody had ever thought that that would be something where our privacy would be up for debate. Today, nearly 2 decades later, we continue to be impacted by the way surveillance changed for our community. The Patriot Act was really just the beginning, but it's been renewed over and over again. And to this day, I meet Muslims who wonder, is their house being surveilled? Are their phone calls being listened to? And the more we lose on this front, the harder it becomes to get it back.
Yeah, I mean, so if I could throw that over to you, Dr. Khalid. You're a professor of law. We start with the Patriot Act, and Sister Zahra spoke about a sort of progression of legislation. What sort of things would, the Muslim community be concerned about from a civil rights perspective that perhaps us in the UK wouldn't have any idea about? What sort of legislation are the Muslim community confronting and trying to overcome when it comes to their day-to-day life and that erosion rather on their civil liberties?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'll start with this, right? So I think it's a misnomer that the Patriot Act in 2001 established surveillance against Muslim communities. The most nefarious dimension of the Patriot Act was a provision called the Federal Investigative Surveillance Act, or FISA. And FISA permitted wide-range, strident surveillance of Muslim communities that had actually been in place since 1996 with a previous piece of legislation called the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. And the architecture for surveillance against Muslim communities was set up by the Clinton administration in the 90s. So places like Detroit, where I'm from, were some of the most policed and surveilled communities in the country pre-9/11, right? The post 9/11 obviously, amplified the degree of surveillance that the Patriot Act ushered in. But one thing that I talk about often in my work and in my book is that 9/11 was not the initiation point of surveillance against Muslim communities. Additional bills that came after the Patriot Act, you had a bill called NSEERS, the National Security Exit and Entrance Registration System, which essentially functioned like a database that mandated that Muslim immigrants enter their names so the government can keep track of where they go and where they come. So we might remember that when Trump was campaigning in 2015 and then in 2016, he announced the idea of a Muslim registry.
Yes.
The fact that a Muslim registry was in place well before Trump ever envisioned running for office. One thing to note today, so now we're entering the 3rd decade of the war on terror. Obviously, it's been roughly 20 years that the real threat today isn't government surveillance. It's actually private side surveillance in this new sort of front and horizon of surveillance capitalism, right? So it's social media platforms, it's corporations that are collecting the data, data mining, and surveilling Muslim populations that leave a virtual footprint online and beyond. I'll give you a quick example before I finish. So the big story last week was that app Muslim Pro that roughly 100 million people use globally.
Yeah.
Right? So that app collected and then sold the data of 100 million Muslims to military agencies, to the CIA and the FBI. So now that we're in this third decade of the war on terror, the real threat is not the state. It's not the government and legislation they pass. The real threat today are social media platforms that all of us consume and engage in speech and activity on.
And that's a totally new dynamic, really. Afaf, Nasher, do you feel that the Muslim community within the United States, do you think that their focus is that they're less afraid now of government surveillance and that they're aware that potentially other agencies, private companies, may be the people who are surveilling them and giving away that information?
I think it's a mixed bag, and this is the reason why I say it. There's more and more information coming out with regards to privacy and security of private companies, such as the example that Dr. Beydoun just mentioned. So we're learning more. Having said that, I know with us in New York, we have been the target of government surveillance and law enforcement, in particular with the NYPD. And I'll give you a quick stat. 95% of NYPD's resources were targeting the Muslim community to the extent, and this became public knowledge with the press breaking news, to the extent that NYPD was literally mapping out areas in which Muslims were concentrated. It was a very extensive effort here on the ground with New York. And I feel that that's not really going to go away, because New York is always a target, because we are New York and we are a financial district and a media capital of the world, so that the city always feels as if it needs to be on heightened security, and they will target Muslims so long as Islamophobia exists. Having said that, even with the privatization of security issues such as the one that we're discussing now, let's remember that the agency that bought that information was the U.S. military, was the U.S. government. So it's one thing to sell my information to a marketer who's going to bother me for a commercial, for some sort of advertisement of a product. It's another thing for the U.S. government to say, this is interesting. They've got data of all Muslims all across the world, and we can use that in the way that we want. So the use of that information continues to be, I think, a threat in government hands, more so than for commercial purposes.
Right, okay. Well, look, we're going to go to a break now. When we come back, I want to touch on some of those things, certainly with the sort of the public-private sector split, and ask the question, really, is Islamophobia an industry? Is it an industry within the United States? Is it a government-funded industry? Is it something that's funded privately? And is there, are there people who benefit directly from creating this fear around Muslims and the Muslim community? So thank you very much, guests. If you could just stay with us, we'll be going to a short break, and we'll be joining you guys again very shortly to continue on tonight's review all about Islamophobia in the United States post 9/11. See you in a minute. Assalamu alaikum, and welcome back to our final segment of the review today. I'm still joined by my guests, Zahra Billu, Attorney at Law, Executive Director for CARE in San Francisco, Afaf Nasher, Attorney at Law and Executive Director for CARE in New York City, and Dr. Walid Beydoun, Professor of Law and Academic. Thank you guys for staying with us. Just before the break, we were talking about the private sector getting in now on this sort of Islamophobia and selling information to governments, which could be useful in the way that they interact with the Muslim community. If I could come to a sort of a broader umbrella question, if I could start with yourself, Sister Zahra, and I'll ask you a question: is Islamophobia, is it an industry? Is it big business?
Absolutely. This is something that predates the Trump administration. CARE, the Center for American Progress, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and others have done a lot of research and have uncovered that there are dozens of nonprofit organizations, so-called nonprofit organizations, as well as so-called professionals who have made entire careers in peddling anti-Muslim hate. Their activities span from developing and sourcing model legislation that they urge state legislatures to pick up, and that many have, that would seek to ban the practice of Islam across a number of states in the United States, training law enforcement and military personnel in biased content around who is a terrorist, how you identify a terrorist, and why, frankly, they should all be scared of, and criminalizing Muslims, to running television campaigns, bus advertisements, newspaper advertisements, and then even just speaking tours. So going to parts of America where people have questions about Islam, claiming to be experts, and then spreading hate. It is a multi-million-dollar industry. And there's been an effort to expose it, to delegitimize it, and even to deplatform some of these people so that they can't access platforms like PayPal and Twitter. But it is a work in progress. And this all existed well before Trump came to office. Unfortunately, him coming to office brought many of these anti-Muslim activists from the fringes into the relative mainstream of right-wing sort of politics of the United States. And so people who were on the corners of the internet, in basements across the country, were all of a sudden going to the White House and claiming to be able to advise the president. And so it pays really well to sell hate.
I want to come back on that, on the issue of Trump and whether Trump gave a voice to existing sentiments that were already there. But if I could come to you, Dr. Khalid, on that same question. I mean, we know that the figures show that within the United States, post-11, that the number of attacks on the public from right-wing extremists outnumber the number of attacks from the Muslim community, or the alleged Muslim community. Is this as well as the sort of NGOs that Zahra mentioned? Is this jobs for the boys? Is this jobs for government departments?
Effectively, it's critical to think about Islamophobia as a structural phenomenon as well, that a wide range of not only nonprofits but private sector organizations and institutions benefit from. I mean, we can look at Hollywood studios, for instance, right, and them peddling caricatures of Muslims and problematic representations and tropes of Muslims is big box office, very lucrative, right? We can look at films like American Sniper. That is an example of the Islamophobia industry, right? I mean, peddling these negative images of Muslims brings butts to seats. We can look at, on an individual level, beyond the institutional level, you have individuals like Ayan Hirsi Ali, Sam Harris, Majid Nawaz, individuals building entire full-fledged careers on the back of Islamophobia and peddling anti-Muslim sentiment and ideas. You can do a search on Amazon, do a search of books on Islam, and oftentimes the highest selling, most popular books deal with demonizing and vilifying Islam and Muslims. So it's a huge industry, and what's nefarious about it is the private side is tethered closely to the political side. Corporations work closely with generating revenue for politicians who run on the back of Islamophobia, not only in the South, but in the Midwest and the West and nationally. So when we think about structural Islamophobia and Islamophobia as an industry, it's both political and economic.
I think you all mentioned at some point Trump. Before we go on to Trump, I want to just ask that same question from Sister Afaf about this idea of Islamophobia being an industry, because I saw you nodding away, actually, both while Sister Zahra and while Dr. Khalid was speaking there. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you're certainly not going to find anything that disagrees with what either of my colleagues said. The truth is that between 2008 and 2013, based on the studies that CARE and other organizations have performed, it was in hundreds of millions of dollars that was being spent in the Islamophobic industry. It was over $200 million within that 5-year period. Yes, people have made their careers, but, beyond the private sector, remember, even when the government engages in Islamophobic practices, so before we were talking about surveillance, well, they need to buy that surveillance equipment from someone, right, for example. So there are a lot of industries and a lot of individuals that are benefiting. Wherever there is fear that can be propagated, there will always be somebody making a huge amount of money off of it.
And that's coming back to something earlier, and I just need to touch on that again. I mean, Dr. Khalid, you mentioned Muslim Pro. Of course, Muslim Pro aren't here today to defend themselves, so we cannot deny or agree with the statement that you made about them. Just bringing it on to Trump, if I may. I'm going to speak very frankly from the outside now. it's been extremely entertaining watching this guy for the last 4 years, okay?
Because he's not your president.
Yeah, it's kind of been, it's been like kind of surreal that this guy can just be so off the wall, so out there, and now it just seems to be escalating with the tweets and the stuff that he's sending out now, and this bunker mentality and not accepting the results and the whole, I mean, it's just incredible. It really doesn't seem to be real. How important or how key a figure do you think he was in giving confidence to the far right? I mean, Zahra, you mentioned, you know, organizations that were on the fringes before being invited to the White House. I mean, how extreme was that?
Very extreme, right? That's the short answer, is that I don't want this to be mistaken for any appreciation for George W. Bush, but he, for a long time after 9/11, walked the line of not using his bully pulpit to spread explicit and virulent anti-Muslim hate. And again, he killed millions of people, many Muslims, invaded many Muslim countries. So his actions didn't match his words, but his words were tempered. When Barack Obama takes office, he is, of course, a secret Muslim president, is what the right wing alleges. And so there's this buildup of an anti-Muslim industry, anti-Muslim sentiment, and the right wing no longer has sort of again, I don't want this to be mistaken for any appreciation for George W. Bush, because my favorite video of him is of the Iraqi journalist throwing a shoe at him, and I think he deserves much more. But that said, that no longer exists. And so Trump comes into office. Trump doesn't happen overnight. There is a buildup. There's almost a culmination of years and years of fomenting. And so all of a sudden, they feel validated. They feel as though they have won. They have access to power. And it's, again, no longer someone on the corners of the internet, but rather the most powerful man in the country, if not the world, spreading anti-Muslim hate.
Yeah, and really, you know, a Muslim ban he brings in almost straight away. I mean, he would say things that you would just think would be impossible for a politician to say. Dr. Khalid, I mean, the Trump era, do you think that now that we're seeing a change in administration, I don't know if anyone's told him yet it's going to happen, but this change in administration that's definitely coming. Do you think that a lot of the extremism that we've seen, the succor that's been given to these far right organizations, do you think that's going to shrivel up and disappear? Or do you think, because we clearly see United States remains an extremely divided country?
Yeah, definitely so. I think that, so I'm going to give sort of a complicated answer in some ways. So I think the culture wars that Trump has stoked are not going anywhere in the United States. The United States is becoming a very polarized place. It's becoming racially balkanized, where Trump has, in many ways, he's was very trenchant in summoning these fringe, sort of bigoted, xenophobic, and Islamophobic actors from the shadow. But when we think about Trump, right, and we think about Trump as kind of being the poster boy or the archetype of Islamophobia based on rhetoric, based on the explicit language they engaged in, but also policy, the Muslim ban being his signature Islamophobic policy. But I'll say this, I'll say in retrospect that the Bush administration was far more destructive, especially with regard to expanding the global war on terror. It launched 2 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. It essentially facilitated foreign governments to launch their own domestic wars on terror on Muslim populations. I mean, look, we can look at what's happening today in China and what's happening in India and Myanmar. Those are very much the progeny of the Bush administration's expansion of the global war on terror. Yeah. So I think in retrospect, 10 years from now, even today, I think if you juxtapose both administrations, I would say that the Bush administration was far more Islamophobic in terms of consequence and praxis. But Trump, engaged in that rhetoric.
So Trump actually, and it's true of Trump in many ways, isn't it? A lot of rhetoric, a lot of speaking, but actually the substance behind it is not always so evident. I tell you something I'd like to ask you, Afaf, if I can. How is it possible that the Muslim vote for Trump went up? This to outsiders just seems unfathomable. It seems unfathomable. I don't understand it. I mean, look, I get the fact that, you know, there might be some businesses who were in favor. I don't know. Can you explain to me? His vote went up, not by a small amount from the Muslim community. At this election, his vote from the Muslim community went up by a very significant amount.
So I'll just say explaining it is not the same as validating it.
Okay.
So I obviously do not agree, and I have a hard time, like you, just fathoming the idea that anyone would support, whether Muslim or not, any person of conscience, in my personal opinion, of course, had to do a real reckoning with their moral principles and values to be able to cast that vote. Having said that, I think you hit it on the nail. Remember, you know, first of all, the Muslim community is very diverse, right?
Yeah.
And it's very important to understand that we're diverse in so many ways. We're diverse in economic, socio, and political viewpoints. We're diverse with our cultural experiences. We're diverse with our religiosity. So all that is important to take into account. And then we also have to remember that, you know, not everyone saw Trump in just one way. Every individual, every human being has multi-facets to their personality. And so where some things resonated with folks, whether it was the economics or whether it was, you know, deregulation of businesses, whether it's just, you know, other factors that they saw that would help them personally in their lives, was something that they were willing to perhaps overlook his deficiencies. And, you know, that's human. Again, though, I don't validate it. But having said that, everybody does have, and that is the beauty of a democracy, that everybody does have the ability to vote for whomever they wish. The issue is, of course, is whether or not President Trump was engaged in trying to suppress votes, right, which is a problem in and of itself. And with whom was he trying to suppress votes? People of color and marginalized communities. And so I remember thinking throughout the entire election process that, you know, even those that support Trump for whatever reason, whether they like his Islamophobic stance or not, considering that the very principle of our elections and our democracy stands on the ability to vote, and he was really engaged in issues with that as well.
Right. We just were losing your audio just towards the end there. I hope we'll get it back because I want to come to each of you for some final words. They say time flies when you're having fun. I can't believe we've done nearly an hour, and we thank you all. Look, CBS News in a recent survey said that 60% of American Muslims had experienced some form of abuse because of their faith. Sister Zahra, the Biden administration looking ahead, it's a new era. I mean, there are so many geopolitical issues now. It's very difficult, I know. But what are your sentiments looking ahead now? Do you think that things are going to get better? Are you pleased with the way Muslims are now engaging, or are you still filled with a sense of dread?
You know, we've spent time talking about the dangerous impact of the Bush administration and the dangerous impact of the Trump administration. A lot of times we skip over the dangerous things that the Obama administration did. And so I am optimistic but cautious as we think about the Biden administration. He has, for example, promised to repeal the Muslim ban, as well as a number of other immigration policies that the Trump administration put into place, but that will just scratch the surface. We've talked about over 20 years of surveillance that frankly predates 9/11. And so our work is cut out for us. And though some of the early appointments the Biden administration has made are good, we also know that one of the things that happens when a Democrat comes into office is a lot of horizontal discipline and censorship on the left that says we should just be grateful we don't have Trump. We need to do everything we can to support here Biden, and this happened after Obama, right? We should just be grateful we don't have Bush. We should do everything we can to support Obama. And so I'm a little worried that will happen. We need to work hard to hold him to his early promises and then to keep on pushing so that we can start to undo some of the damage of the last 20 years.
Yeah, okay. If I can come to you, Dr. Khalid, with that. I mean, we saw Biden making a very deliberate attempt to engage the Muslim community in the run-up to the election. I saw him, I think, quoting a hadith, I think I saw, in one of his speeches, using the word inshallah in another one. Is this just rhetoric? Is it just game playing? Or do you think that we're likely to see a very conscious change in direction in terms of the attitude towards Muslims from the administration and the willingness to engage with Muslim communities on a genuine level?
Well, look, I think that, you know, it's difficult under a democratic administration to be critical in the same way as it is toward a Republican administration. I'll be frank, right? I think the threats we'll see under the Biden administration are analogous to what we saw under the Obama administration. We're going to see an expansion of, I think, more hawkish policy on the foreign policy front. We're going to see a restoration of surveillance that was called counter-radicalization policing here in the States. You guys in Great Britain called it prevent. So Islamophobia is going to shift. It's going to adapt. It's going to be more clandestine in the sense that you can't see it and feel it in the same way that you saw it with Trump. So, and I think the Biden administration is going to be very clever and sort of capitalizing on what I call racial capitalism, you know, putting Muslims in positions of power, sort of to, you know, appease the Muslim population to say, hey, we got members of your community as part of this administration, which in many ways disarms critics on the ground and advocates on the ground and activists to be critical in the ways they should be critical. We saw that under Obama. Remember, I think it was 6 months after Obama was elected, he gave that beautiful speech at Azhar in Cairo. And we thought this was a moment of progress where he was mending the wounds of the war on terror. However, we saw an escalation of droning. We saw surveillance being established. So I try not to think about it as, you know, Biden being the better of two administrations. It's not a qualitative issue for me. It's sort of like, you know, us as a population and a community of Muslims adjusting to be as critical and to be as strategic with fighting the threats as they adapt under this new administration.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And final words from yourself, Sister Afaf. I think we've just... Oh, right, we're going to try once more. We've just lost your link again. We will try once more. Sister Afaf?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
I can.
All right, thank you. So I was going to say, yes, I think that there will be some good coming out. There have been promises made, but as Sister Zahra pointed out, we have, and the Muslims at this point, we have to make sure that the accepted fall off the table. That rather we are learning through the process the issues that we have faced as a community, that we do have the power to hold our elected officials accountable for our vote, but also putting in our own elected officials. And this soon is that there's a reckoning to be dealt with the Muslim community as well. Some positive changes to come out. Well, there was the promise, as you said, and making no mistake about it, that has impacted people very severely. Devastated so many families. Do you expect that foreign policy will continue to be a problem with regards to Islam and Muslims around the world? Yes, I do. But it'll always be a mixed bag, and it's up to the Muslim American community to advocate its position strongly and to hold people accountable when they don't meet the interests that we need to have.
Thank you. And I do apologise for that connection there. I was able to catch most of what you said. Thank you to all of my guests for joining us this evening. Thank you to Zahra Billu, to Dr. Khalid Baidoun, and to Afaf Nasher, and to, of course, to our guests in the first segment. We've been dedicating, as you know, the whole of November's review show to Islamophobia awareness. So please join us next week on Wednesday when we're going to be looking at the worrying trends of Islamophobia in India. But from all of us here at the review team, to all of our guests, thank you again. We'll see you soon, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.